All right, thank you everyone for the time today. Win reality. So when we initially approached this concept of having to recreate or simulate a pitch, it's a daunting task. It first took an incredible amount of investment in understanding the physics behind the pitch. But then that had to be matched with an equal understanding of what the hitter is seeing. And when you think about that highly debated topic, what the hitter is seeing, how you're seeing it, the mechanics of the pitch and what the eyes and body is doing while you're looking at the pitch, it really pushed us to a level to where in order to build an effective pitch recognition training program around this task, we had to first dig in deep and take a lot of myths and rip them apart and then piece them back together. So one of the first things that I'd like to talk about is within the pitch, what is actually happening? You're using information in order to predict when the pitch is going to arrive at the contact zone and then where it is going to be when it arrives at the contact zone. So within that time period and distance spectrum, there's a number of pieces of information that we can pull from, whether it's the biomechanical cues of the pitcher or ultimately is spin something that's important that allows us to understand and make good decisions about where the pitch is going to be and when the pitch is going to arrive. Before we get into each one of these, what I'd like to talk you through is a little bit more about the human visual constraints that come into play when and how players are extracting information from those sources. So first and foremost, I think a lot of you are pretty aware of spatial acuity. So when you hear someone say that you have 20/10 vision or 20/20 vision, that is a direct reference to the acuity, the resolution in which you're taking in information. And that spatial acuity really comes within a spectrum, call it like a foveal cone, in which you are getting that highest resolution. And that foveal cone moves from 60 feet to home plate. You're looking at more of like a 5 feet, 4 inch span in which you can pull in that type of high resolution information. Critical in hitting that you're getting as much information as you can from the pitch. Every detail is so important. Second piece that is really not talked about quite as much is more of the temporal acuity, and that is the rate in which your brain is bringing in this information. And that rate in itself is met with really distinct limitations. We're pulling in information between 40 and 60 hertz. That's really the equivalent of us maxing out around 60 frames per second. And if you think about it in terms of how a video camera captures information, each one of those frames is bringing in a different piece. But in a half a second, then that means that you're only getting about 30 potential slices of information in which to take value away. It's not a lot. You have really no margin to spare. When you pull in that information, you really need to be pulling it in at the highest rate possible. And so we have the spatial acuity, the resolution of it, and then the temporal acuity, the rate at which it's coming in. Next piece, how do we maximize both of those? Typically, you would think when you're tracking a pitch that the eyes would be a big component, a factor in which tells you this information. But in fact, when the eyes are moving, rapid eye movement, saccade, it's really leading to you suppressing the maximum information that you can pull in. So that saccade suppression is inherently going to prevent you from pulling in the maximum amount of information that you can. So then how do we overcome that? How do we take it to a point where we can pull in the most information possible? And this gets to the vestibulo-ocular reflex suppression. We're basically coupling the eyes and the head together and using the head as almost like a steady cam. It's a fixed axis in which there's a slight head movement, which allows you to keep your eyes in a stable position. So if the eyes are in a stable position, in order to keep your foveal view visual angle and target with the pitch, it then gets back to you being able to keep your eyes fixed. And so some of these mechanics here will then really speak to what information can be pulled out from the pitch and why some of this information is more important and valuable and more leads to better decisions more than others. All right, so the first thing, biomechanics of the pitcher. So coming into this, you would expect, I'm gonna move to this video right here, that there would be some information relative to the change in release point that could tell you about when and where that pitch is going to be located. So in other words, if you take a release point for a pitcher's fastball and then look at that release point on that same pitcher's curveball, there may be some change in that XY coordinate that tells you what type of pitch it could be. Shockingly, pitchers have become so consistent with that XY fingerprint that there's really no information available. No matter what pitch type is being thrown from a pitcher, even if it's through the windup or stretch, the result is you're looking at the same point. So that basically takes a change in release point out of the equation. It's really not something you can rely on. But what is great about this is that what it's telling you is that if you can figure out where that XY coordinate is for a pitcher, then you've got him. That is the spot. That's consistent information. It's reliable because it's going to be coming out of the same spot every time. This is not just true at the big league level, it also has translated to at the collegiate level as well. So the next piece of information, okay, well, you hear it. Man, I saw his hand at release. I saw him come around the ball. But in fact, based on the speed in which the external to internal rotation happens and the constraint in which we're pulling in information, being 60 hertz, everything within that span is a blur. So when a hitter says, like, hey, I saw his hand, is really you just filling in gaps from a blurred image and saying, okay, well, actually what you saw potentially is that there was more palm, the blur was wider, the blur was on the side. But to some degree, it's not the most reliable information for players to pull in. So if we're looking at optimizing the gaze strategy and what matters in hitting, the biggest takeaway that we can pull from the biomechanical cues is just where that pitch is going to start. Because once that pitch starts, once it's out of the hand, the clock is ticking. And there really puts us in a position to where if you find that pitch from the initial release, it gives you an opportunity to pull in information from the phase of the pitch that is most important, where there is the most information available to be extracted, and that is the velocity and trajectory. So if we look at this chart right here, what you'll see is that we can essentially work backwards from the hitter's point of view to determine how much time a hitter has before they need to make a decision. So first and foremost, let's take into account the time to contact. Based on a player's time to contact, it's going to tell us when that swing needs to be initiated in order to be on time to the pitch. And then another factor that comes into play is the propagation of the neural signal from the brain to the mechanics of the swing, so that how long does it take you to decide, yes, I'm going to swing, or yes, I'm going to make a go decision to actually start that movement? That's about 40 milliseconds. So basically, this is pushing up the distance in which a decision has to be made very quickly, so that there's only a window in which that decision can be made in order for you to be on time. So that's really the bottom spectrum there. And as you see, as the pitch increases in velocity, that window is shrinking. The second piece is, okay, well, how much time do you actually need to take away information about the ball flight before you are in a window where there's enough information even available? And that's where when the pitch is initially released, let's call it 55 feet, you have about 35 feet to work with in order to look at the velocity change and the trajectory change, and then have cues that are present to say, okay, yes, this is going, I should make a go decision, or no, I should not go. And so when you look at this spectrum right here about what is happening in that roughly 35 feet, you're starting with the snapshots. So I talked earlier about temporal acuity. And so when you're pulling in these samples, you're pulling them in based on a fixed rate, but the velocity of the pitch is going to tell you what that fixed rate distance is. So let's take an 85 mile an hour pitch. You may see it first at 55 feet, and then the next time you see that pitch, it's at 53.75. And whereas that same pitch at 95, you may first see it at 55 feet, but then again, you don't see it till it's at 52.95. So that pitch is traveling farther between snapshots. And where that comes into play is that within the spectrum that you have of time to work with, you have to use all that time to see how many snapshots I can have before it's in a position where I have to fire. And so as the velocity increases, you're getting less information, but then you can leverage that. You can leverage the fact that, hey, I saw less snapshots, and I'm spatially aware enough to know that that pitch is at a distance that I have to hit go. So that pitch is likely a higher velocity. So those snapshots are what fundamentally is telling you when the pitch is going to arrive at home plate. And in turn, what those also tell you is the way in which the trajectory is changing from one snapshot to the next is then a piece of information that can be used to say, okay, if it was initially here and then on the next snapshot it's a little bit lower, I'm going to leverage that information to then fill in the gaps to know what happened between that change and if that change is significant enough to tell me where the pitch will end up being located. So when we look at how we're going to eventually track in that differential, it comes down to this vestibular ocular reflex suppression that I mentioned earlier. And so what you'll see in this video right here from Soto in the World Series actually really illustrates well what is happening. You'll see that his eyes and head are fixed from the time the ball is released to well past the swing being initiated. There is zero movement. His eyes are completely in a fixed location. And what is so powerful about this, it is basically telling him that he set his visual angle in the right spot, and as the pitch was traveling in, he was using and leveraging as much information, visual and temporal acuity as he could, resolution of the pitch, taking in every sample so that he could make a decision that when he fired, there was not many adjustments that had to be made. Okay, so then pairing velocity and trajectory differential is really working backwards. So if you know that you get less snapshots on a pitch, that typically means it's higher velocity. And if you see larger changes in horizontal movement, then it's likely let's call it a slider. So that pitch moved on the horizontal axis a little bit more between snapshots. It was a higher velocity. Process of elimination. You pair this information, you're getting enough. There's enough information there for you to make good swing, go or no-go decisions, swing decisions. All right, so that gets us to a point now. We've talked about the release point. Does the release point matter? Yes, that point, that XY fingerprint does matter. We've talked about the velocity trajectory, and we're past a distance now, let's call it 19 feet, where the decision has been made. Let's assume it is a go decision. Well, at what point in time does spin play a factor in the pitch? And so if you look at the diameter of a baseball and the size of the baseball in space and the distance it would be away in space, we can basically say someone with a 20/10 vision, that type of acuity, can see a static object at 32 feet away spinning. That's great. A baseball is not a static object. It's moving, and it's moving really fast. So at best, you cut those numbers in half, and you would be able to perceive spin at around 16 feet. So at that point in time, your go decision has already happened. It's too late. You're going no matter what. But then let's say you get a snapshot, 3 snapshots of seeing what the spin looks like. Well, is that information valuable? What do you actually do with it? So at that point in time, when you begin to see details on the ball, spin characteristics at 16 feet, that gives you a window of potentially 2 snapshots, 6 feet, where you can make a swing adjustment, swing plane adjustment. So if guys have already committed, there is time to make a change, and that's when spin plays a factor in that. So then after you utilize that feet, let's say 6 feet worth of ball flight, what's the next stage? Well, the next stage, and what you'll see in this video right here, and I can go back to it as well, is that Soto makes a pivot from the ball to the contact range. And it's not like an eye pivot, it is just a very subtle head turn that brings him to where he predicts contact will be. So in other words, at 10 feet, you know that your swing is gone, it is set, everything is going. So then what more information can be taken away? And that's information about the end location of the pitch, where it is, and then that's so much, everything is set sail at that point. So what he's doing when he's pivoting to that end location is moreover looking at and helping build the catalog and library and database for the next time he steps in the box. To say, okay, I must have misread this pitch, so how can I use this end snapshot to tell me what I need to adjust on the next pitch or in the next at-bat? And so that's where the catalog of experience play such a huge factor in how that database can be built up and more robust and eventually refine what happens earlier in the phase when you're making that swing decision out at that 19-foot mark. And so, in summary, kind of to walk you through this just one more time, critical to find the release point. Reliable information is consistent. If you understand each pitcher's XYZ fingerprint, then it's going to give you a chance to pull from that 55-foot mark. If you pull at that 55-foot mark information, you're in a good spot then to have as much time as you can utilize and you're not constrained. Second piece, couple the eyes and head. So very abnormal to think that, wow, you would want your eyes to be locked in and still in order to process the most information, but in that span, your visual field is large enough to where they don't have to move. In that 35 feet mark, that 35 feet that you have to work with, your eyes can be locked in the same position and you can see what you need to see. Next one, really key in on what the velocity is telling you. When you hear players come back in the dugout and their explanation for potentially why they chased a pitch was, I saw a slider spin. Well, actually, no, let's talk about what happened before that. Why were you in a position to where you weren't trusting what the velocity and trajectory was telling you? That is reliable. Every single pitch utilizes the same type of constraints, no matter who the pitcher is. So being the best and optimized at being keen on seeing velocity changes and trajectory changes is going to be the way to optimize swing decisions. Next piece, once you make a go or no-go decision, then you're really turning it over to how do you adjust the swing plane. You have time to work with. Is there any last-minute cues to make the adjustment? In which case, then, after that happens, you're pivoting to contact point in order to refine the catalog, and then you're just doing this over and over and over again. This takes years, time, and really game experience to get great at. So that information right there, talking about from the time someone steps on the rubber to that contact point range, how does this boil down into actually applying to you and your program and how you think about a pitch recognition training program? So ultimately, when you have machine work done, when you have, let's say, you take a L screen, you move it up to 45 feet, and based on the velocity of the BP thrower that factors into being the equivalent of a 90-mile-an-hour pitch, that's great. But chances are is that your release point and that trajectory of the pitch is not going to follow the same type of path that it would for that last 45 feet of ball flight as it does from a pitcher's hand. So there are just really no imperfect ways in which you're currently practicing and you look through the daily routine that actually train the pitch perceptual, cognitive, and skill acquisition methodologies that would translate to improving that skill. So knowing that what you're doing may not actually improve the skill, what it can do is it can create good behavior. So a player can step in, and if you see him or her essentially being lazy with the eyes, that probably tells you, one, they're thinking about the mechanics of their swing, but two, just in every time they pick up a bat and they help them have intent with, okay, I'm locked in. You see their eyes getting big, and when you see their eyes getting big and you see a stable head position, you at least know that they're putting themselves in a position to where that type of, the mechanics of it, the behavior of it, can translate to the game. So that is where current routines are useful, but outside of actually being able to replicate the entire pitch sequence from a pitcher being on the mound, it being completely task-specific, variance in release points that change but are consistent on a pitch-to-pitch basis, the total information being available, that's really where simulation training comes into play. It is a piece to it. It's not the full spectrum, but ultimately it is a piece that gets you to a point where, yes, game experience is great. We do not have, as an industry, the ability to play games all the time and really accelerate a player development curve by only playing games. So we have to turn to other training tools, and we spend a lot of time practicing. And simulation training really pulls you into a position where it is as complete as it gets from the perceptual cognitive training side. Yeah, that's it. Oh, a lot of PhDs created this, and I'm here translating. So a lot of questions can be thrown back to them as well. That's it. Questions can also be directed at me over at the booth, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Awesome. Awesome.